long before missiles traced the sky over Jerusalem, long before the name Iran echoed through war rooms and headlines. There was a tent in the desert, and in that tent, a decision that would fracture the world. What if I told you that the longest war in human history didn't begin with armies or borders, but with 2 baby cries? 2 sons. 1 blessing. 1 choice that still bleeds through the centuries. The world sees politics, but heaven sees prophecy. You've watched the headlines. Iran threatens Israel. Israel prepares for war. The Middle East burns with a fire that never dies, but buried beneath every missile launch, every broken ceasefire, every diplomatic failure, is a wound that began in Genesis, a spiritual custody battle between 2 ancient bloodlines that refuse to surrender. This isn't just conflict, this is covenant. The name Persia appears 35 times in your Bible, not as footnote, as prophecy. God didn't just see Cyrus coming. He called him by name 150 years before he was born. He didn't just witness the rise of Iran, he wrote it into the end-time script. From Daniel's visions to Ezekiel's warnings. From Esther's palace to Revelation's final war. The land we call Iran has been marked by heaven's hand. But here's what they don't tell you in the evening news. This war will never end. Not because diplomats have failed, not because hatred runs too deep, but because it was prophesied to continue, written in blood and spoken by angels. The hand of Ishmael, the Bible declares, will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. That wasn't just personality, that was destiny. Right now, as you watch, this ancient prophecies are moving like chess pieces across the world stage. The nations are gathering, the players are positioning, and the final act of a drama that began 4,000 years ago in Abraham's tent is about to unfold. But here's the question that should terrify and awaken every believer. If God already wrote the ending, why are we still surprised by the beginning? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about the Middle East. This isn't just news. This is the Word of God in real time. And the clock is ticking. Chapter 1. The war that began in a womb. 2 women, 2 wounds, 1 man, 1 promise that divided the world. Picture this. The greatest conflict in human history didn't begin with tanks rolling across borders. It didn't start with oil or ideology or ancient hatred carved into stone monuments. The war that refuses to die, that burns through every generation, that turns brothers into blood enemies, began with the sound of weeping in a tent. A barren woman's tears falling like prophecy onto desert sand. Her name was Sarai, and in her silence and the aching emptiness of her womb, something was stirring that would fracture the world for 4,000 years. God had made Abraham a promise so vast it defied human understanding. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. Through you, all families of the earth will be blessed. Genesis 12:2-3. But there was one problem, one devastating, hope-crushing reality that mocked the promise every sunrise. Sarai was childless. Year after year, she watched the seasons turn. She felt her body age. She counted the months, the cycles, the cruel repetition of hope followed by heartbreak. And the silence of her womb grew louder than thunder. What do you do when God promises descendants as numerous as the stars, but your arms remain empty? What do you do when the covenant feels like a cruel joke whispered by a distant deity? You take matters into your own hands. Look now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please, go into my maid, perhaps I shall obtain children by her. Genesis 16:2. Those words spoken in desperation, wrapped in wounded faith, became the spark that ignited a war spanning millennia. Sarai handed her Egyptian servant, Hagar, to her husband, not as a wife, as a vessel, a surrogate for a promise that seemed too slow in coming. And Abraham agreed. What began as a decision born of doubt became a disaster written in destiny. Hagar conceived. And suddenly, the slave had what the mistress could not. The maid carried the heir that the wife had been denied. Can you imagine the tension crackling through that tent? The jealousy burning like acid in Sarai's chest? The bitter irony of watching another woman swell with the child you've prayed for, wept for, ached for. Jealousy ignited into cruelty. Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, so harshly that the pregnant woman fled into the wilderness to die rather than endure another day of abuse. But God saw the Egyptian maid weeping beside a desert spring. And in that moment of abandonment, the angel of the Lord spoke the first prophecy that would echo through every Middle Eastern headline for the next 4,000 years. You shall call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Genesis 16:11-12. Let that prophecy settle into your spirit. A wild man, his hand against every man's hand against him. This wasn't just describing a personality. This was divine foresight, carving destiny into the very DNA of a nation yet unborn. Ishmael would not merely be Abraham's son, would be the father of a people marked by perpetual conflict, endless resistance, generational rage. And God wasn't finished. 13 years later, when Abraham was 99 years old and his faith had been refined in the furnace of impossibility, God appeared again, this time with a promise that would shatter Ishmael's world. Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. Genesis 17:19. One son gets the covenant, the other gets greatness, but not the promise. There it was the divine line drawn in the sand. Both boys would carry Abraham's blood, both would be blessed, both would become great nations. But only one would inherit the covenant that included the land, the nation, the Messiah, and the world's redemption. Isaac, the child of promise, born to a woman past childbearing age, would carry the seed through which all nations would be blessed. Ishmael, the child of flesh, born through human effort and impatience, would become great, but would forever stand outside the covenant. When Isaac was finally born, Sarah laughed. The same woman who had wept in barrenness now erupted in joy so profound that she named her miracle child Laughter. But the celebration was short-lived. At Isaac's weaning feast, Ishmael, now a teenager, mocked his baby brother. Sarah saw it, and her protective fury exploded. Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. Genesis 21:10. Abraham was torn. This was his firstborn, his beloved son. But God's voice cut through his anguish with shocking clarity. Do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. Genesis 21:12. And so, for the second time, Hagar found herself cast into the wilderness. But this time, she carried with her not just a pregnancy, but a teenager whose identity had been shattered, whose birthright had been stripped away, whose future had been redefined by rejection. As they wandered in the desert of Beersheba, their water ran out. Hagar placed her dying son under a shrub and walked away, unable to watch him perish. Let me not see the death of the boy, she wept. Genesis 21:16. But again, God heard. He opened her eyes to a well of water and spoke a promise over the rejected son. I will make him a great nation. Genesis 21:18. Ishmael survived. He grew strong in the wilderness. He became an archer, a warrior, a prince, over 12 tribes. But he never forgot the wound, never forgot the blessing that was given to another, never forgot the covenant that passed him by, and neither did his descendants. What if I told you that every rocket fired from Gaza carries the echo of Ishmael's tears, that every chant of death to Israel is the voice of a rejected son demanding the inheritance he believes was stolen? The Arab-Israeli conflict isn't about borders or settlements or political ideology. It's about a wound carved in Genesis that has never healed. A spiritual custody battle between two ancient bloodlines, both claiming the same father, but only one holding the deed written by God himself. The prophecy over Ishmael that he would be a wild man with his hand against every man wasn't a curse. It was destiny, and it's still being fulfilled in every generation. Because deep in the heart of the Arab world lives the memory of rejection. The burning question, why not us? Why Isaac and not Ishmael? Why the child of the free woman and not the son of the slave? But the wound of Ishmael would not be the last scar carved into Abraham's tent. Chapter 2. Brothers divided, nations born. The laughter of one child became the exile of another. Picture this, an old man's tent, trembling in the desert wind. Inside, two women, one barren, one fertile, one free, one enslaved. And between them, a promise that would split the world in two. Sarah had waited, Oh, how she had waited, 25 years of empty arms and silent wombs while God whispered about descendants like the stars. But when faith finally wore thin and desperation took the wheel, she made a decision that still echoes through missile strikes and peace treaties today. Perhaps I can build a family through her, Sarah said, pushing her Egyptian maid toward Abraham's tent. What she built wasn't a family, it was a fracture, a spiritual fault line that would one day crack open into the bloodiest rivalry in human history. Hagar conceived, and suddenly, the servant had what the mistress could not. The jealousy was immediate, vicious, consuming. Sarah's cruelty drove Hagar into the wilderness, pregnant and alone, to die under an unforgiving sun. But God found her there, by a spring of water, carrying the future of nations in her womb. You shall name him Ishmael, the angel declared. He will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. He will live in hostility toward all his brothers. That wasn't a personality reading. That was a prophetic blueprint, the spiritual DNA of endless resistance, written into the bloodstream of a people before they ever drew breath. Ishmael was born into rejection. Not because he was unloved, but because he was unthosen. Abraham cherished him, circumcised him, raised him for 13 years as his only heir. But when God spoke again, the words fell like thunder in a clear sky. Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. There it was, the divine line in the sand, both sons from Abraham's seed, both blessed, both destined for greatness, but only one chosen for the covenant. Only one heir to the promise that would reshape eternity. When Isaac was born, Sarah's laughter finally rang through the tent, but it was Ishmael's tears that would water the desert for generations to come. The breaking point came at a feast. Isaac was being weaned, and Abraham threw a celebration. But Ishmael, now a teenager watching his place in the family dissolve, began to mock his little brother. It was the laughter of the displaced, the bitter jest of the rejected, and Sarah saw it. Get rid of that slave woman and her son, she demanded with fire in her eyes. He will not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Abraham's heart shattered. How do you choose between sons? How do you exile your firstborn for the crime of being second in God's eyes? But when he cried out to heaven, God's response was clear and terrible. Listen to Sarah. Through Isaac your offspring will be reckoned. So once again, Hagar found herself in the wilderness, this time with a teenage boy and a water skin that wouldn't last the journey. When the water ran out, she placed Ishmael under a bush and walked away because she couldn't bear to watch him die. Her sobs echoed across the desert like the first notes of a lament that would play for thousands of years. But God heard the boy's cries. He opened Hagar's eyes to a well of water and renewed his promise. I will make him into a great nation. Ishmael lived. He grew strong. He became an archer, a warrior, a father of 12 princes, but he never forgot the wound of that wilderness, the pain of being born into a promise that was never meant for him. And that pain became the inheritance he passed to his sons, and they to theirs, generation after generation. You see, this wasn't just family drama. This was the birth of two civilizations. Isaac's line would become Israel, the people of the covenant, carriers of the law, guardians of the oracles of God. But Ishmael's descendants would become the Arab nations, vast, mighty, proud, but forever carrying the ache of rejection, the burning question, why not us? The Apostle Paul would later write that the child born of the flesh wars against the child born of promise, and he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was describing a spiritual reality that plays out in headlines every single day. Flesh versus promise. Human effort versus divine election. The children of the bondwoman rising against the children of the free. This is why every peace treaty crumbles. This is why every ceasefire fails. Because buried beneath every negotiation table is a 4,000-year-old wound that is never healed. The descendants of Ishmael are not fighting just for land or politics or justice. They're fighting for recognition, for validation, for the promise they believe was stolen. Islam would later rewrite the story, claiming it was Ishmael, not Isaac, who was nearly sacrificed. It was Ishmael who received the covenant. It was Ishmael who deserved the inheritance. But the Bible doesn't budge. From Genesis to Galatians, the message is clear. The covenant line runs through Sarah's son, not Hagar's. And yet, and here's where grace meets heartbreak, God never cursed Ishmael. He blessed him, promised to make him fruitful, declared he would father a great nation. The Arab peoples are not mistake. They are not forgotten. They are loved, valued, seen by God, but they are not chosen for the covenant. And that distinction, that hair-thin line between blessing and election, has become the razor wire that divides the Middle East. Can a nation ever heal from a promise it believes was stolen? Can the children of Ishmael ever find peace without the inheritance of Isaac? The answer lies not in politics or diplomacy, but in another promise. Another son, one who came not to call the righteous, but sinners, not to bless the chosen few, but to open the door of salvation to whosoever will. Because at the cross, there is no Jew or Arab, no Isaac or Ishmael. Only sinners in need of grace and a Savior big enough to heal the deepest wounds. But the tension would deepen when God reversed the order again, this time, in the womb. Chapter 3. The second-born who became Israel. Before they ever spoke a word, destiny divided them in the womb. The ultrasound of eternity had already declared war. 2 heartbeats, 2 nations, 2 destinies wrestling in the darkness of Rebekah's womb, fighting for a birthright that heaven had already assigned, but not to the one you'd expect. 2 nations are in your womb, the Lord whispered to their mother, and 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Think about that. Before either boy had committed a sin or performed a righteous act, before either had spoken their first word or taken their first step, God had already chosen. The election wasn't based on merit. It was based on mystery, divine sovereignty that cuts through human logic like lightning through darkness. Esau emerged firstrid, rugged, wild, the kind of son a father dreams of, strong hands, broad shoulders, a hunter's instinct. Isaac loved him for the venison he brought to the table, for the stories of conquest whispered around evening fires. Esau was everything a firstborn should be. Everything. Except chosen. Jacob came second, gripping his brother's heel as if refusing to accept the order of birth. Quiet, calculating, a man of tents while his brother roamed the fields. And in that grip, that desperate clutch at his brother's ankle, was a prophecy in motion. The younger grasping for what God had already promised him. The second-born who would become Israel. But here's what pierces the heart. Esau never knew. For years, he lived as the heir apparent, confident in his birthright, secure in his father's love, unaware that heaven had already bypassed him. Can you imagine the weight of that discovery? The moment when everything you believed about your identity crumbles like ancient parchment in your hands. It happened over a bowl of stew. Red lentils. Steam rising. Esau returning from the hunt, faint with hunger, desperate for sustenance. And Jacob, always watching, always waiting, saw his moment. "Sell me your birthright first," Jacob demanded. "I am about to die," Esau gasped. "What good is a birthright to me?" One meal, one moment of weakness, one decision that would echo through millennia. But even that wasn't the end. Years later, when Isaac was old and blind, Jacob would steal the blessing that sealed his destiny. Disguised in goatskins, speaking in whispers, receiving what God had already promised him, though not the way God intended it to unfold. When Esau discovered the deception, his cry shattered the tent. "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" He wept. "He has taken away my birthright. And behold, now, he has taken away my blessing." That cry, that anguished, desperate, soul-deep wail still echoes today. Because Esau became Edom, and Edom became the eternal symbol of the Passover, the rejected, the ones who watched their younger brother receive what they believed was rightfully theirs. The parallels crash like thunder. First, Ishmael, rejected for Isaac. Now, Esau, bypassed for Jacob. 2 older brothers. 2 bitter wounds. 2 lineages that would carry the poison of divine rejection in their bloodstream for generations. And here's where the story turns dark as Babylon's night. Because Edom didn't just disappear into history. They circled Israel like vultures, waiting for weakness, feeding on failure. When Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians, who was there to plunder the ruins? Edom. When Israel suffered, who rejoiced in their pain? Edom. The prophet Obadiah thundered against them. "For your violence against your brother Jacob, Shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. But Edom was more than a nation. Edom was a spirit, the spirit of the rejected brother, the spirit that says, if I cannot be chosen, then I will oppose the chosen. The spirit that would eventually merge with the bloodlines of Ishmael, creating a double helix of resentment that still pulses through the Middle East today. Many scholars trace Arab tribal genealogies not only through Ishmael but through Esau as well. Intermarriage, migration, alliance, the rejected sons of Abraham finding common cause in their common wound. One passed over for Isaac, one displaced by Jacob, both carrying the genetic memory of divine rejection. And Jacob? Jacob became Israel, after wrestling with the angel of the Lord beside the Jabbok River. His name changed from heel grabber to God wrestler. But even in his triumph, even in his transformation, the wounds he had caused his brother never fully healed. This is the second fracture in the tent of Abraham, the second crack in the foundation of humanity. And like the first, Ishmael and Isaac was not about human favoritism. It was about divine election. God's sovereign choice to build his covenant through specific lineages, regardless of birth order, strength, or human expectations. Election is not earned, it is revealed. Paul would later write to the Romans, though they were not yet born and had done nothing, either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. She was told, the older will serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Those words still cut like sharpened flint. Not because God is cruel, but because God is sovereign. His love is not arbitrary, but it is absolute. His choices are not random, but they are beyond human appeal. Yet even in Esau's rejection, there was provision. Isaac blessed him too. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. A prophecy of perpetual tension. Esau would serve Jacob, but not forever. Edom would submit to Israel, but not permanently. The yoke would be broken. The rebellion would rise, and the cycle of conflict would continue until the Prince of Peace returns to end all wars. Today, when you see the rage of nations surrounding Israel, remember, this is not new hatred. This is ancient wound. The cry of Esau still echoes in the hearts of those who believe they were passed over. The spirit of Edom still whispers in the councils of Israel's enemies. But here's the mystery that should make every believer tremble. What if your greatest wound came from being passed over by the hand of God? What if the blessing you thought you deserved went to someone else? What if God's choice offended your sense of justice? The answer is not rebellion. The answer is Romans 9:20. But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me thus? God's election is his prerogative. His sovereignty is his glory, and his gracio, his graces available to both the chosen and the passed over, but only through the cross of Christ. And as Jacob became Israel, Ishmael and Esau's bloodlines began to circle him not as family, but as fire. Chapter 4. 12 sons, 12 princes, 2 worlds. From the dust of Abraham's loins came 2 kingdoms, both claiming the same God. The tent of Abraham was no longer filled with the laughter of one child. By the time the patriarch breathed his last, 2 bloodlines had emerged from his flesh, and they were multiplying. Ishmael had been sent away, but not forgotten. Isaac had inherited the covenant, but not exclusive dominion over the family tree. And as the dust of Genesis began to settle, the world was quietly being shaped by 2 lineages, both tracing their names to the same father, both destined to become civilizations. The scriptures say Ishmael had 12 sons, and these are the names of the sons of Ishmael, 12 princes according to their tribes. Princes not vagabonds, not nomads without identity, but leaders of clans, founders of regions, architects of a people scattered wide, growing strong, born of rejection, yet destined for expansion. God had promised Hagar that her son would be fruitful, that he would become a great nation. And here, in the dry lands, east of Egypt and south of Canaan, the prophecy began to bloom. Meanwhile, Jacob, son of Isaac, grandson of Abraham, was having sons of his own, 12 of them, not princes, but patriarchs. Not scattered tribes, but a single house. 12 brothers who would form the pillars of Israel, each with a banner, a destiny, and a territory yet to be claimed. Their names were engraved into the nation's soul: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. These were not just children. They were the foundation stones of a chosen people. And thus began the unfolding of two parallel empires, one by covenant, one by dispersion. Ishmael's 12 sons became the fathers of Arab tribes that spread like wildfire across the deserts and highlands of the Middle East. They mingled with the descendants of Esau. They absorbed others from the line of Keturah, Abraham's later wife. They adapted to the winds of survival. Theirs was a legacy of tents and trade routes, of oral stories and territorial pride. They were fierce, proud, and unyielding, a people formed not by law, but by endurance. They built no tabernacle, but they remembered their origin. They knew they were of Abraham. Jacob's sons, however, were shaped by revelation. They were forged in slavery and led through fire. Their tribes did not simply form. They were refined in Egypt, redefined in the wilderness, and finally rooted in the promised land. Israel was not just a family, it was a divine project. Their nationhood came with commandments. Their identity was carved in stone by the finger of God. They carried a priesthood, a temple, a scroll of covenant. Theirs was not survival in the wild, it was submission to a calling. Yet both lines, Jacob's and Ishmael's, claimed to walk in Abraham's shadow. And here lies the tension. The Arab peoples that arose from Ishmael's sons would eventually give way to cultural empires, the Nabateans, the tribes of Arabia, and later the Islamic caliphates. Though centuries would pass before Islam was born, the groundwork had been laid by a self-understood identity that they too were sons of Abraham. But where Israel traced lineage through Isaac and covenant through Moses, the Arab descendants remembered Hagar. They saw in their fathers a legacy denied, a firstborn right that in their view had been unjustly stripped. Civilization only deepened the divide. Israel became a people of land, calendar, and commandment. The sons of Ishmael became a people of migration, passion, and oral law. Israel had a priesthood. Ishmael's line had warriors and poets. Israel received Torah. Ishmael's legacy would eventually produce the Quran. 2 nations, 2 sets of 12, both born of the same man. But one became a chosen nation, the other, a wild federation. And while Israel had Mount Sinai, the Arab tribes looked toward Mount Paran. While Israel remembered Moses and the Exodus, the Arabs clung to their ancestral journey through deserts untamed. And in time, these two civilizations would not just grow, they would collide. But in Genesis, before all the wars, before the swords and the prophecies and the political lines, we see the raw material. 12 sons here, 12 sons there. 2 bloodlines stretched into kingdoms, 2 destinies moving like rivers that would one day meet in storm. The Jewish tribes were called to carry the Ark of the Covenant. The Arab princes were destined to become vast, unified not by revelation, but by resistance. What happens when 2 nations carry the same blood but walk in opposite destinies? The answer is written in sand and stone, in every headline that burns across our screens today. Because the war that rages in the Middle East is not just about oil or borders or even religion, it is about inheritance. It is about which son holds the keys to the covenant made in Genesis 12. One bloodline was chosen to bear the seed of the woman, the Messiah, who would crush the serpent's head. The other was blessed, but not chosen. And that distinction, carved into the foundations of time itself, still echoes through every rocket fired, every treaty broken, every summit that fails to bring peace. The sons of Ishmael multiplied into nations. The sons of Jacob multiplied into tribes. Both remember Abraham, both claim his blessing, but only one carries his covenant. And that truth written in heaven before the first tent was pitched in Canaan is why the war will never end. Not until every knee bows to the one who came through the line of Judah. Not until the Prince of Peace returns to claim the throne that was always his. And as the tribes of Ishmael grew into warriors, the tribes of Jacob were being carved into a people of covenant. Chapter 5. The Prophet of Retaliation. A voice rose from Arabia claiming to rewrite the covenant. The desert had been silent for 600 years. No burning bush, no angelic visitation, no thunder from Sinai. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob seemed to have withdrawn his voice from the sons of Ishmael. They had multiplied as promise said, scattered across the Arabian Peninsula like stars across the night sky. 12 princes, just as the angel had foretold, but they carried no tablets of stone, they built no temple, they offered no sacrifices that pleased the Lord. And then, in the year 610 AD, the silence shattered. In a cave outside Mecca, a 40-year-old Arab merchant named Muhammad claimed that an angel had seized him. Not just any angel but Gabriel himself, the same messenger who had announced the birth of Isaac to Sarah, the same voice who had called to Hagar in the wilderness. But this time, the message was different. Revolutionary. Dangerous. "Read," the angel commanded. And through Muhammad's lips, a new scripture began to flow. Not in Hebrew, but in Arabic. Not for the children of Isaac, but for the children of Ishmael. Not as an addition to the Bible, but as its correction. What if I told you that Islam was never meant to be just another religion? What if it was designed from its very foundation to be a retaliation, a divine reversal of everything the Bible had declared about Abraham's sons? The Quran didn't ignore Abraham, it claimed him. It didn't reject the patriarchs, it rewrote them. In this new revelation, the son of promise was not Isaac, the child of miracle, born to Sarah in her old age. It was Ishmael, the firstborn, the rightful heir, who had been unjustly cast out. Listen to the theological earthquake hidden in these pages. According to Islamic teaching, it was not Isaac who was bound upon Mount Moriah when Abraham raised the knife. It was Ishmael, the most sacred moment in Jewish history, the near sacrifice that proved Abraham's faith and foreshadowed the cross was transferred from the child of promise to the child of rejection. Do you see the brilliance of this strategy? Do you feel the spiritual violence embedded in this revision? By changing the identity of the sacrificial son, Islam didn't just alter a detail, it dismantled the entire foundation of Jewish claim to the covenant. If Ishmael was the one nearly sacrificed, then Ishmael was the beloved son. If Ishmael was the beloved son, then his descendants, not Isaac's, were the true heirs of Abraham's blessing. But the revision went deeper still. The Quran declared that Jews and Christians were people of the book, but a book that had been corrupted. The Torah, it claimed, had been altered to hide the truth about Ishmael. The Gospels had been twisted to deify a mere man named Jesus. Only through Muhammad's revelation could the world finally hear the uncorrupted word of God. This was not just theology. This was warfare, spiritual warfare dressed in the robes of religious reform. Muhammad, this descendant of Ishmael, stood in the Arabian desert and essentially declared, "Everything you have been told about God's chosen people is a lie. The real covenant was with us. The real promise was to us. The real inheritance belongs to us." And the Arab tribes listened. After centuries of watching the children of Isaac claim divine favor while they wandered the margins of sacred history, here was a prophet from their own bloodline telling them that they were not the rejected ones, they were the chosen ones. The fire spread like wildfire across the desert. Within a single century of Muhammad's death, Islamic armies had swept across 3 continents. They conquered Persia, the ancient land of Cyrus and Esther. They seized Egypt, the birthplace of Moses' miracles. They captured Syria, where Paul was struck blind on the Damascus road, and in 638 AD, they entered Jerusalem itself. But they didn't just conquer territory, they conquered narrative. Where the Temple Mount had stood as the holiest site in Judaism, the place where Abraham had nearly sacrificed Isaac, where Solomon had built the house of God, where Jesus had overturned the money changers' tables, the Muslims built the Dome of the Rock. Not accidentally, intentionally. They were making a statement in stone and gold. This is our story now. The Jewish people, scattered across the Roman Empire in exile, watched in horror as their most sacred site was claimed by those they considered the spiritual descendants of their ancient rival. The children of Ishmael had not just survived their exile from Abraham's tent, they had returned to conquer Abraham's altar. But beneath the political conquest lay something far more sinister, a theological inversion that turned the entire biblical narrative on its head. In the Islamic retelling, the Jews became the villains of their own story. They were portrayed as covenant breakers who had rejected prophet after prophet. They were accused of killing the messengers God had sent to them. They were described as a people so corrupt that God had finally withdrawn his favor and transferred it to the Arabs. Jesus himself was conscripted into this narrative not as the Son of God who died for the sins of the world, but as a Palestinian prophet who had come to warn the Jews of their coming displacement. His crucifixion was denied. His resurrection was dismissed. His divinity was declared a blasphemous fabrication. Do you see the pattern? Islam didn't just offer an alternative path to God. It systematically dismantled every pillar of biblical faith. The covenant with Abraham, transferred to Ishmael. The sacrifice on Mount Moriah, reassigned to the rightful son. The chosen people, replaced by a new community of believers. The Son of God, reduced to a mere prophet. The cross, denied as a Christian myth. The resurrection, dismissed as apostolic invention. This was not reform. This was replacement. Not revelation, but retaliation. And it worked. For over 1,000 years, Islamic civilization expanded while Jewish communities survived as tolerated minorities under Muslim rule. The children of Isaac lived in the shadow of the children of Ishmael, paying special taxes, following special laws, reminded daily that they were no longer God's chosen people. The ancient prophecy was being fulfilled with terrifying precision. Ishmael would indeed live in hostility toward all his brothers. But now that hostility was clothed in religious authority, backed by military might, and justified by divine revelation, what if your entire faith was built to undo a single promise? For nearly 14 centuries, this theological war has raged beneath the surface of every political conflict in the Middle East. When Arabs speak of liberating Palestine, they are not just talking about land, they are talking about reclaiming a narrative. When they deny Israel's right to exist, they are not just making a political statement, they are reasserting a theological claim that goes back to Muhammad's cave. The State of Israel, reborn in 1948 after 2 millennia of exile, represents more than just Jewish national aspirations. To the Islamic world, it represents the return of a people who should not exist, a covenant that should have been canceled, a promise that should have been transferred. Every Israeli flag is a contradiction to the Quran's claims. Every Hebrew prayer is a challenge to Islamic theology. Every Jewish child born in Jerusalem is a living reminder that Muhammad's revision of biblical history has not been accepted by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And with the rise of the crescent, the children of Isaac found themselves surrounded by the rage of ancient prophecy. The war that began in a tent between 2 sons has become a war between 2 scriptures, 2 peoples, 2 claims to the same God. And it will not end with diplomacy, because it did not begin with politics. It began with prophesy, and it will end with prophecy. But whose prophecy will prove true? Chapter 6, Jerusalem, the crown both sons covet. A city smaller than New Jersey, yet crowned with divine controversy. There are places on earth that hold secrets, ancient stones that have witnessed empires rise and fall, blood spilled and prayers whispered. But there is one city, one small patch of Middle Eastern soil that holds something far more dangerous than secrets. It holds a promise. Jerusalem. The name itself ignites wars. 3 religions claim it, 2 bloodlines fight for it, and one God declared it his own, before any of them drew breath. I have chosen Jerusalem that my name may be there. The words thunder from 2 Chronicles 6-6, not as suggestion, but as decree, not as invitation, but as ownership. This wasn't David's choice. This wasn't Solomon's preference. This was heaven's decision, carved in stone before the foundation of the world. But here's what makes Jerusalem so dangerous. Both sons of Abraham believe it belongs to them. The Jews point to David's throne, to Solomon's temple, to 3,000 years of tears shed toward these walls. This is our eternal capital, they declare, the city of the great king, the place where heaven touches earth. The Arabs point to their own claim, their own narrative, their own sacred story. This is Al-Quds, they counter, the holy city, the 3rd most sacred site in Islam, the place where our prophet ascended to heaven. 2 peoples, 2 stories, 1 city, and only 1 deed written by the finger of God. But why Jerusalem? Why this particular hill in this particular desert? The answer reaches back before Islam was born, before Christianity emerged, before Judaism even had a name. It reaches back to a moment when an old man named Abraham climbed a mountain with his son, carrying wood for a sacrifice that would echo through eternity. Mount Moriah, the place where God provided a ram, the place where Isaac's life was spared and a covenant was sealed in blood and fire. The same mountain where David would build an altar, the same hill where Solomon would raise a temple, the same stones where Christ would be crucified and rise again. This wasn't random geography. This was prophetic destiny. Jerusalem was never just a city. It was a throne room waiting for its king. But the sons of Ishmael never forgot what happened on that mountain. In their hearts, a wound festered not just rejection, but replacement. They watched Abraham's other line inherit the blessing, claim the land, build the temple. They watched Jerusalem become the beating heart of Jewish identity, the magnetic north of their prayers, the golden thread connecting exile to hope. Next year in Jerusalem, the Jews whispered in Babylon, in Rome, in Berlin, in Moscow. For 2,000 years of exile, that city remained the center of their longing, the focus of their faith, the promise that kept them alive when the world tried to bury them. But to the descendants of Ishmael, every Jewish prayer toward Jerusalem was a reminder of their exclusion. Every stone of that temple was a monument to their rejection. Every song of Zion was a knife twisting in an ancient wound. And then Islam arose. In 638 AD, barely 6 years after Muhammad's death, Muslim armies conquered Jerusalem. They found a city sacred to Jews and Christians, but they declared it sacred to Islam as well. They built the Dome of the Rock precisely where Solomon's temple once stood, not by accident, but by intention. They renamed it Al-Quds and declared it the third holiest site in their faith. But here's the staggering truth. Muhammad never set foot in Jerusalem. The entire Islamic claim rests on a single verse in the Quran describing a night journey to the farthest mosque. Yet when that verse was written, no mosque existed in Jerusalem. The city was Christian. The Temple Mount was empty ruins. But Islam needed Jerusalem. Because to control Jerusalem was to challenge the very heart of Jewish identity, to say your covenant is broken, your claim is void, your God has chosen new heirs. This is why the battle for Jerusalem cuts deeper than politics. It's not about borders or buildings. It's about legitimacy. It's about which son truly inherited Abraham's blessing. It's about whose prayers have the right to rise from these ancient stones. The Jews returned to the Western Wall and press their foreheads against stones that once held the presence of God. They weep for a temple destroyed, for a glory departed, for a Messiah who tarries, but they return, because this is the place God chose. This is the city he called his own. This is where their future is anchored, no matter how long the exile lasts. The Muslims bow toward Mecca 5 times a day, but they guard Jerusalem like a sacred trust. Because to lose Jerusalem would be to admit something too painful to bear, that perhaps the covenant never transferred from Isaac to Ishmael, that perhaps Muhammad's claims were never confirmed by conquest, that perhaps this city belongs to the sons of Jacob after all. Can you feel the weight of it, the spiritual pressure building beneath these ancient stones? This is not just real estate. This is the epicenter of a war between heaven and hell, between divine election and human pride, between what God has chosen and what man desires to claim. Every peace treaty that mentions Jerusalem fails. Every negotiation that tries to divide this city collapses. Why? Because you cannot negotiate what belongs to prophecy. You cannot compromise what God has declared eternal. You cannot split a crown between 2 heads without destroying both. The Bible is mercilessly clear about Jerusalem's future. Zechariah prophesies that all nations will gather against it. Ezekiel describes armies surrounding it. Jesus wept over it, knowing what must come. Because this city, small as it is, embattled as it has always been, is the stage where human history will reach its climax. The throne room is waiting, the king is coming, and when he arrives, there will be no more argument about who owns this city. Until that day, the sons of Abraham will continue to bleed for streets they both call holy. They will continue to pray toward stones they both call sacred. They will continue to die for a city that belongs to neither. And both. And ultimately, only one. But the battle for the city would one day spill beyond politics into prophecy written in fire. Chapter 7. The Scrolls of Gog and Magog. Before Iran pointed its missiles, it was already named in heaven's war scroll. The prophet Ezekiel sits by the river Chebar, his eyes heavy with visions too terrible for mortal minds to bear. The Spirit of the Lord falls upon him like fire, and suddenly he sees beyond the veil of time itself. There, written in the Chronicles of eternity, is a war that has not yet come. A coalition of nations, led by a mysterious figure called Gog, marching against the apple of God's eye, and among the armies gathered for this final assault. There it is. Persia, the same Persia that once freed the captives, now marches to destroy them. What if I told you that Iran's headlines today were already written in heaven's script 2,600 years ago? That every missile pointed toward Jerusalem, every threat hurled across the airwaves, every alliance forged in the shadows, was seen by a prophet in exile who wept as he wrote what God showed him? Ezekiel 38 doesn't whisper, it thunders. Son of man, Set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. But God doesn't stop with one enemy. He names the coalition. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Persia. Not a footnote. Not a maybe. Persia, ancient Iranus, written into the end-time script with the precision of divine decree. The vision unfolds like scenes from a film yet to be shot. Gog, the mysterious prince from the north, draws together a confederation of nations drunk on ancient hatred. Russia, many scholars believe, leads this unholy alliance. Iran provides the fury. Libya and Sudan bring the numbers. Turkey offers the bridge between continents, and together they look south toward a land the size of New Jersey and see a prey. After many days you will be visited, God declares to this coalition. In the latter years you will come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. Do you see it? This isn't just any war. This is the war against the impossible, a nation that shouldn't exist, gathered from the dead, speaking a language that was silent for 2 millennia, dwelling in cities built on ancient ruins. Israel, the miracle that makes atheists tremble, becomes the target that unites her enemies. But why Persia? Why the nation that once sent Cyrus to rebuild the temple? The answer cuts deep into the mystery of divine sovereignty. God doesn't just use nations. He allows them to reveal their hearts. Persia was blessed when it blessed Israel, but when it chooses to curse what God has blessed, judgment follows like thunder after lightning. Iran today speaks the language Ezekiel heard in his vision. Death to Israel echoes from Tehran's parliament chambers. Nuclear facilities hum with uranium enrichment. Proxy armies mass on Israel's borders, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, militias in Syria. The pieces aren't just falling into place. They're being positioned by the same God who scattered them. Ezekiel sees their confidence, their overwhelming numbers, their certainty of victory. You will say, I will go up against a land of unwalled villages. I will go to a peaceful people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, and having neither bars nor gates. They see weakness. God sees setup. Because this isn't just Israel's battle. This is God's theater. It will be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land, the Almighty declares, so that the nations may know me when I am hallowed in you, O Gog, before their eyes. The war of Gog and Magog isn't about land. It's about the name above every name. It's about a generation that has forgotten who rules the nations, discovering in fire and earthquake and divine intervention that the God of Israel still sits on his throne. The weapons of this coalition will fail. Their armies will turn on each other. Their leaders will fall by their own swords. And when the smoke clears and the mountains tremble with the footsteps of the Almighty, there will be 7 months of burials and 7 years of burning weapons. Not because Israel was stronger, but because the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is jealous for his holy name. Iran stands at the crossroads of prophecy and choice. The nation that once carried the decree of restoration now contemplates the tools of annihilation. The land that birthed the Magi who worship the newborn king now follows leaders who deny his deity. Persia, inscribed in Daniel's visions as silver, has become the iron mixed with clay, strong, yet brittle, mighty, yet doomed. But prophecy is not fate. It is warning. Even now, underground churches spread across Iran like fire in dry grass. Even now, dreams and visions of Jesus pierce the darkness of Islamic oppression. Even now, the descendants of those who once blessed Israel have the chance to choose blessing over cursing, salvation over destruction. The scrolls of Gog and Magog are open. The stage is set. The players are taking their positions. Iran's leaders speak of Israel's destruction while Israel's God prepares to defend his inheritance with signs and wonders that will make the 10 plagues of Egypt seem like whispers. What if the nuclear threat Iran poses isn't the real danger? What if the real catastrophe is that they're walking eyes wide open into a divine trap that will reshape the Middle East forever? And in the ashes of war, a forgotten prophecy flickers to life once more. Chapter 8. Elam's broken bow. The bow of Elam will be broken, but not forever. In the sacred chambers of prophecy, where God's justice meets his mercy, there exists a mystery that has confounded scholars for millennia. A divine paradox written in the ancient scrolls of Jeremiah, chapter 49, words that thunder with judgment, yet whisper with hope, words that speak of Iran. I will break the bow of Elam, the mainstay of their might. Elam, the forgotten kingdom of southwestern Iran, the ancient heartland where Persian power would one day rise. And here, buried in the prophetic archives, God speaks a verdict that cuts both way swift as a sword, tender as a father's hand. What if I told you that the same Iran threatening Israel today was once promised restoration by the God of Israel? What if the nation now aligned with Gog and Magog carries within its destiny a thread of redemption that even its own leaders cannot see? This is the mystery of Elam's broken bow. The prophecy begins with thunder. God's voice, through Jeremiah, declares war against a kingdom that had not yet fully formed. I will bring upon Elam the four winds from the four quarters of heaven. I will scatter them toward all those winds, and there shall be no nation where the outcasts of Elam shall not come. This was not merely military conquest. This was divine scattering. The bow symbol of Elam's military prowess, their pride, their strength would be snapped like kindling in the hands of the Almighty. The people would be driven to the four corners of the earth, refugees in lands they never knew existed. And for centuries, it seemed this prophecy held only darkness. Elam was absorbed into the Medo-Persian Empire, its people scattered like seeds on barren ground, its bow indeed broken, its might reduced to memory. But God's prophetic scrolls do not end in darkness. They never do. Yet it shall come to pass in the latter days. I will bring back the captives of Elam, says the Lord. In the latter days, those four words shimmer like starlight in the prophetic darkness. They speak of a time yet to come, a restoration yet to unfold, a divine reversal that defies human understanding. Think about this. While Jeremiah was pronouncing judgment upon Elam, he was simultaneously announcing its redemption. While the bow was being broken, the promise of restoration was being written. The same God who would scatter would also gather. The same hand that would strike would also heal. This is not political commentary. This is prophetic revelation. Iran modern Elam stands today as one of Israel's greatest enemies. Its leaders chant death to America, death to Israel, in parliament halls. Its proxies fire rockets into Jewish neighborhoods. Its nuclear program inches toward weapons-grade uranium. By every earthly measure, Iran appears to be moving further from God, not closer to him. And yet, underground in Iranian cities, something remarkable is happening. House churches are multiplying in secret. Muslims are encountering Jesus in dreams and visions at unprecedented rates. The gospel is spreading through a nation whose government has sworn to destroy it. Young Iranians are walking away from Islam in numbers that terrify the Ayatollahs. Could this be the beginning of Elam's restoration? Could the same soil that breeds hatred also birth revival? The timing is prophetic. Iran's current alignment with Russia and its coalition partners mirrors exactly what Ezekiel saw in his vision of the end times. Persia, marching with Gog. The bow of Elam raised once more against the mountains of Israel. The final confrontation that will trigger God's direct intervention. But here's what sends chills down the spine of every student of prophecy. Jeremiah's promise of restoration comes after the judgment. The captives of Elam return after the bow is broken. The revival comes after the war. What if the war of Gog and Magog is not Iran's end, but its purification? What if God allows Iran to march with the coalition, not to destroy Israel, but to destroy the false gods in Iran's own heart? What if the fire that falls from heaven burns away not just armies, but the spiritual blindness that has kept Persia from recognizing her Messiah? In God's courtroom, verdicts are never simple. Judgment and mercy dance together like flames in a sacred furnace. The same fire that consumes also purifies. The same storm that destroys also cleanses. Consider the pattern. Babylon conquered Israel, but it was through Babylon that God refined his people. Egypt enslaved the Hebrews, but it was through Egypt that God revealed his power. Assyria scattered the northern kingdom, but it was Assyria's brutality that drove the people to their knees in repentance. Could Iran be following the same divine template, used as an instrument of judgment, then broken by that same judgment, then restored to become a testimony of grace? The martyrs in Iranian prisons seem to believe so. They pray not just for their own deliverance, but for their persecutors' salvation. They see beyond the hatred in their captors' eyes to the image of God that hatred has tried to destroy. They know what Jeremiah knew, that God's plans for Elam are plans for good, not evil, plans to give them a future and a hope. This is the mystery that keeps prophetic scholars awake at night. How can the same nation that arms Hezbollah also experience the fastest church growth in the Middle East? How can the regime that denies the Holocaust also host a population increasingly hungry for the Jewish Messiah? The answer lies in the nature of God himself. He is patient, he is sovereign, and he specializes in impossible resurrections. When the bow of Elam is finally broken, and Scripture guarantees it will be something beautiful will rise from the ruins, not another empire, not another ideology, but a people, a remnant, a testimony to the world that no nation is beyond redemption when the God of Abraham sets his mind to save. The Persian Magi once followed a star to worship a Jewish baby. Could their descendants one day follow that same light home? Because in God's courtroom, mercy is often written beneath the verdict. Conclusion. And so the scroll closes, but not on the story, only on this chapter. From the dust of Eden to the headlines of today, we have traced a thread older than empires, deeper than hatred, more enduring than the cedars of Lebanon, the thread of Persia, the mystery of Iran. We began in Abraham's tent, where two sons split a household and fractured the world. We watched Cyrus rise from desert obscurity to become God's anointed, a pagan king speaking Hebrew prayers he never learned. We stood with Esther as she walked uninvited into a Persian throne room, carrying the weight of her people's survival. We witnessed Daniel's visions pierce through time itself, naming kings before they drew breath, describing wars before armies were born. And now we find ourselves here. In the epilogue. In the days the prophets saw, but could not fully understand. Iran today is not the same Persia that freed the captives or funded the temple. Neither is it a stranger to the God who once called it by name. It stands now in the shadow of prophecy, positioned exactly where Ezekiel placed it among the coalition of the end, the armies of Gog, the final test of Israel's faith and the world's allegiance. But here is what haunts the careful reader of Scripture. God's story with Persia is written in paradox. The same hand that once lifted it up will one day strike it down. The same voice that called Cyrus my shepherd will thunder against Iran's rebellion. The same fire that once protected Esther will burn through the ranks of those who march against Jerusalem. And yet, Jeremiah whispers of restoration. In the latter days, I will restore the fortunes of Elam. Could it be that what we are witnessing is not Iran's final act, but its darkest hour before dawn? Could it be that the nation now breathing threats against Israel is walking unknowingly toward its own appointment with the God of Abraham? Could it be that the underground churches praying in Persian cities are the first fruits of an ancient promise finally coming to harvest? The questions linger like incense in a holy place. You and I, we are not observers of this drama. We are participants. We live in the generation that has seen Israel reborn, Jerusalem reunited, and the nations aligning exactly as the prophets foretold. We scroll through news feeds that read like passages from Ezekiel. We watch tensions escalate with the rhythm of prophecy unfolding. This is not coincidence. This is not politics. This is the sovereign hand of God moving pieces across the chessboard of history, preparing for his final move. So what does that mean for us? It means we must watch, not with fear, but with faith, not with despair, but with discernment, not as victims of circumstance, but as witnesses of prophecy. It means we must pray for Israel, yes, but also for Iran, for the Jewish heart to recognize its Messiah, and for the Persian soul to remember the God who once called it friend, for enemies to become worshipers, for swords to become plowshares, for the lion to lie down with the lamb. Because if God can use a pagan king to rebuild his temple, if he can place a Jewish orphan on a Persian throne, if he can turn Saul the persecutor into Paul the apostle, then no nation is beyond his reach. No heart is beyond his power to change. The conflict that began in Abraham's tent will not end with treaties. It will end with truth. The war that started with 2 baby cries will conclude with one voice, the voice of the one who was and is to come, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Prince of Peace. Until that day, the headlines will burn. The tensions will mount. The prophecies will quicken like labor pains. And iron ancient Persia, mysterious Elam, will play its appointed role in the final act of human history. But in God's courtroom, the final verdict is always redemption. And in his temple, Even the stones that once cried for war will someday sing. The thread of Persia, the mystery of Iran. We began in Abraham's tent, where two sons split a household and fractured the world. We watched Cyrus rise from desert obscurity to become God's anointed, a pagan king speaking Hebrew prayers he never learned. We stood with Esther as she walked uninvited into a Persian throne room, carrying the weight of her people's survival. We witnessed Daniel's visions pierce through time itself, naming kings before they drew breath, describing wars before armies were born. And now we find ourselves here. In the epilogue. In the days the prophets saw, but could not fully understand. Iran today is not the same Persia that freed the captives or funded the temple. Neither is it a stranger to the God who once called it by name. It stands now in the shadow of prophecy, positioned exactly where Ezekiel placed it among the coalition of the end, the armies of Gog, the final test of Israel's faith and the world's allegiance. But here is what haunts the careful reader of Scripture. God's story with Persia is written in paradox. The same hand that once lifted it up will one day strike it down. The same voice that called Cyrus my shepherd will thunder against Iran's rebellion. The same fire that once protected Esther will burn through the ranks of those who march against Jerusalem. And yet, Jeremiah whispers of restoration. In the latter days, I will restore the fortunes of Elam. Could it be that what we are witnessing is not Iran's final act, but its darkest hour before dawn? Could it be that the nation now breathing threats against Israel is walking unknowingly toward its own appointment with the God of Abraham? Could it be that the underground churches praying in Persian cities are the first fruits of an ancient promise finally coming to harvest? The questions linger like incense in a holy place. You and I, we are not observers of this drama. We are participants. We live in the generation that has seen Israel reborn, Jerusalem reunited, and the nations aligning exactly as the prophets foretold. We scroll through news feeds that read like passages from Ezekiel. We watch tensions escalate with the rhythm of prophecy unfolding. This is not coincidence. This is not politics. This is the sovereign hand of God moving pieces across the chessboard of history, preparing for his final move. So what does that mean for us? It means we must watch, not with fear, but with faith, not with despair, but with discernment, not as victims of circumstance, but as witnesses of prophecy. It means we must pray for Israel, yes, but also for Iran, for the Jewish heart to recognize its Messiah, and for the Persian soul to remember the God who once called it friend, for enemies to become worshipers, for swords to become plowshares, for the lion to lie down with the lamb. Because if God can use a pagan king to rebuild his temple, if he can place a Jewish orphan on a Persian throne, if he can turn Saul the persecutor into Paul the apostle, then no nation is beyond his reach. No heart is beyond his power to change. The conflict that began in Abraham's tent will not end with treaties. It will end with truth. The war that started with 2 baby cries will conclude with one voice, the voice of the one who was and is to come, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Prince of Peace. Until that day, the headlines will burn. The tensions will mount. The prophecies will quicken like labor pains. And Iran, ancient Persia, mysterious Elam, will play its appointed role in the final act of human history. But in God's courtroom, the final verdict is always redemption. And in his temple, even the stones that once cried for war will someday sing of peace. The story continues, the prophecy breathes, and somewhere in the depths of divine mystery, Persia's future waits to be written. Because in God's hand, even ashes can become altars, and Persia's flame may rise again, this time in worship.